I'm going to introduce our first speaker. For many of us, Dr. Fausch needs no introduction. Kurt Fausch is a stream ecologist and professor emeritus at Colorado State University in the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Conservation Biology, where he has taught for 35 years. His research collaborations in stream fish ecology and conservation have taken him throughout Colorado and the West and internationally, including to Hokkaido in northern Japan. His experiences were chronicled in the PBS documentary River Webs and the 2015 book For the Love of Rivers, A Scientist's Journey. And that's a really fantastic book. Highly recommend it to anybody interested in fisheries or fish ecology. It's amazing. And that book won the Sigurd F. Olsen Nature Writing Award. He's also received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the American Fisheries Society and the World Council of Fisheries Societies and the Leopold Conservation Award from Fly Fishers International. So with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Fausch and enjoy.
This is a talk about really a whole career of work. I have to say at the beginning, I'm not a salmon biologist. I have worked on salmon, but the other thing to say is that some of this information for many of you will be almost historical. It's things that you may have seen in graduate school or as an undergraduate. And if that's the case, I'm really happy because that means that somebody thought it was important and you should maybe see it. So I should also shout out Dave Hare-Simchuk and Jeremy Monroe of Freshwaters Illustrated, former students. Some of these amazing images like this one are their work. And so to begin, I owe an awful lot to a lot of colleagues and students. Kevin Bestian and Julie Scheuer worked on plains fishes. Chaz Gowan here on the left worked on this wood project we'll talk about. There's Jeremy and Dave, the videographers. Carl Saunders on grazing. Some of you know Jeff Falke. He's now the unit leader at Nevada, and his three mentors, Jason Dunham and Keith Giddo and myself. Probably you're having a hard time picking me out in this figure. I'm the one on the left there. This is a whole group in Japan. Standing in front of me is Masashi Murakami, and then Colden Baxter next to him. We'll talk about Colden's work. And then lastly, my late colleague, Shigeru Nakano, who was lost in the tragic accident in 2000 in Baja California with Gary Polis here in California. An amazing ecologist, and we'll talk about his work. So whenever a professor stands up, you need to make a transformation. Whenever they say I, they really mean we. Whenever they say we, they really mean they. So if you can just transform that in your mind, that'll account for the role that we play. So this talk is very simple. It's about 7 key lessons that I felt we learned over the years. Little vignettes about all of those. The studies. This is cut off a little bit at the top, but anyway. The studies, their relevance and their importance, I think. And the first one is quite simple. This is me in graduate school, Michigan State University. We were catching, you can see here, brown trout to take their eggs to do lab experiments on competition among salmonids. Graduate school was really a blast. All I ever wanted to be was a fish biologist to do the research to help people understand these problems and how to manage fish. But the thing is, when you write papers from that, they all get rejected. Every paper that I ever wrote from my Ph.D. work, including the main data paper, was rejected twice. That first paper that's very visible to you may be something that many of you have seen. But when I retired, I started making a list of all the rest of the ones that we published, and many papers that we wrote were rejected, sometimes up to 4 times. And so the first lesson for any of you building a career, here I am, new at Colorado State, bad haircut. My wife was making my clothes and cutting my hair. That's the lesson. Persistence and determination are really everything. This is a quote that is attributed actually to Calvin Coolidge. So I'm preaching to the choir really when I say that fresh waters are this amazing engine and source of biodiversity. These are, I think, saffron shiners that Jeremy and Dave took pictures of in Tennessee. There's this great biodiversity. We know that these fresh waters make up less than 1% of the area of water on the planet, less than 0.01% of the volume, and yet they harbor about 18,000 freshwater fishes. In fact, about 10% of all animals, vertebrates and invertebrate animals on the planet that have been described are in fresh waters. And yet these animals are in trouble. This is some data from Wilkove and Master. It's an older paper in bioscience. This is based on the state nature serve accounting of those animals that are, it says on the bottom, percent extinct to vulnerable. So it's all of those animals that are on somebody's list. And you can see if you put a box around the freshwater animals that these are big numbers. And they happen to be the same really around the world for the IUCN data, for example, that in the range of a third of all fishes, in North America, half of all crayfishes, about 70% of the native mussels, 75% of the native snails are on somebody's list. Whereas you can see for the terrestrial vertebrates there, mammals, birds, and reptiles, it's only about 20% or less, 1 in 5. And we know that the reason for this is partly because we've channelized these habitats. Where I live in Colorado, we simply dry up rivers. But a big reason is that we've not sustained the connections that these animals need to carry out their whole life cycle, from the, 41 dams in the Columbia River system to the millions of culverts under every dirt road and every forest, under every highway. They don't even need to be perched like this one to basically stop animals from moving upstream through them and causing problems with larger dams of animals moving downstream. We know this for the large-bodied fishes. This is one that we have in the interior west. This is a Colorado pike minnow. This is kind of a juvenile, a high school sort of age individual. They originally grew to be 1.5 times this length. They make spawning migrations that are in the 250-kilometer range in the or they used to in the Colorado River Basin. Here's suckling taimen, one of the 5 species of taimen across Eurasia. Amazing animal. My colleague Michio Fukushima, all the way at the northern tip of Hokkaido, works on this animal. They're iteroparous, like steelhead. It's kind of amazing. The males turn that red color on and then they turn it off after they get done spawning. So we know these big river fishes all over the world need these connections, but as it turns out, many smaller bodied fish also need it. This is common shiner, or another species similar, striped shiner. My friend and colleague Ike Schlosser worked on this animal for his Ph.D. in Illinois. They'd move kilometers to places to spawn. And so Ike and Paul Angermeyer put together this very simple diagram, which again, you may have seen, but I think this is a really powerful idea. There's basically 2 ideas about this. What I've written at the top is a model of fish life history at the riverscape scale. And they're very simple. The first is that the habitats these fish must have to spawn, rear, and find refuge are not in the same places. They're dispersed throughout watersheds. And the second key point, also very simple, is that movement is the glue that glues together these fish's life history. So the first lesson that I really encountered, the first major project that I got funding for when I came to Colorado State, was to work on these high mountain streams. They're really beautiful, crystal clear water, beautiful forests. And that lesson, again, is very simple, that trout move. This is something that, I'm sorry that that's cut off, but it says lesson number 2, trout move. This is something that takes a longer story to tell why we came to this. These streams, actually, though they look fairly pristine, they're fairly degraded. And the reason is maybe the same in your region for some places, is that to build a transcontinental railroad across the United States took millions of railroad ties, and these railroad ties were cut out of these forests. Men called tie hacks went up in the winter, cut lodgepole pine, and then drove those logs down these channels to wherever the nearest railroad was and took them out to the end of the railroad to make it. But of course, in order to do that, they needed to remove all the large roughness elements out of these channels. All the logs and boulders were blasted and cut out to make these sluices. And so you can imagine 100 years later, you're then left with this channel that's basically clean. Beautiful forests have grown up. The water is crystal clear, but there's nothing to make pools or any kind of habitat for these fish. So starting in the 1930s, fisheries managers working with the CCC didn't really maybe understand this legacy of the loss of wood and boulders from these channels, but they knew how to make pools. And yet, when I arrived in the 80s, nobody really knew whether these worked, whether indeed putting this kind of habitat in streams actually would increase trout populations. So we tested that in a big field experiment, 6 streams, treatment and control sections, 10 logs in the treatment section, none in the control, marking fish in those to try to answer the question whether some moved from one section to another. And the result was quite simple and dramatic. Trout biomass of adult trout increased by nearly half in these streams. The literature on stream habitat enhancement says usually either this doesn't work or it doesn't last. So we went back 21 years later into these channels, measured it again, and again it was 50% higher. Most of that literature is here on the Pacific Northwest, where you have massive winter floods that blow everything out. These are very, very stable channels. They have not moved since the glaciers left. You put wood in them and anchor them appropriately, and the habitat is there 20 years later at least. Not one of the logs had moved out of 6 streams times 10 logs. So that was also an interesting result. But what was astounding was that the increase didn't happen the way we thought. People thought you made pools, increased overwinter survival, maybe increased growth. And we didn't find that in these streams. So of the 2 PhD students, Steve Riley and Chaz Gowan, over an 8-year period, 4 years each, Steve was the one that saw in the data that every year we went back, even though we validated that we were catching nearly all the fish and marking them, half the brook trout, these are brook trout streams mainly, some brown trout, were totally unmarked. They didn't come from the control section with that mark. They came from somewhere else. So Chaz then, for the last 4 years, constructed weirs in 2 of the streams, marked fish away from these channels or these sections, up to 2 kilometers away. We thought that was a long distance based on the literature for trout in small 3 to 5 meter wide streams. And yet a large proportion of those fish encountered these weirs in our treatment sections and control sections within 90 days. And the median movement was nearly a mile for these fish. So we realized that this movement was driving this population increase. Now I have to say that since then, people often say, well, that just means that the wood attracted fish. And I would say to that, those were immigrants, they came from somewhere. Well, the point would be that they attracted fish and you really didn't increase trout populations stream-wide. So if those fish came from somewhere, if you believe that you hadn't done anything to increase the population, then you probably would never let anybody go fishing, because the implication is if a fish is removed, that fish will never be replaced by a juvenile fish that'll survive better. So that has yet to be tested, to be able to actually measure those kinds of processes at a whole riverscape scale. but it doesn't really make sense from first principles. We ended up writing a paper about a restricted movement paradigm that you may have seen if you're working in that field. Chaz found that many people had misinterpreted their marking data and didn't really realize how far these fish might move. So that caused us to really change the way we thought about these fish. Oftentimes we were working up at really big scales at the GIS satellite scale with mapping programs, or down at very fine scales measuring things in great detail. But we realized that a lot of action for these fishes is at this segment scale that's like 1 to 100 kilometers long. It's a very difficult scale for us, especially in this period around 2000, to measure. It's not a scale you can easily walk over. Now we have, of course, pit tags and antennas. We can do a better job. But the point is that these fish, this is kind of the nexus. This is the scale at which they carry out their whole life history. They may spawn in one place, rear in another. The adults go somewhere else for the summer habitat, and often down into deeper, more stable areas to overwinter. So they need to move among these habitats for survival, growth, and reproduction. And yet, because it's a dendritic hierarchy, any barrier that we put in, or is even naturally there, will influence and confound these movements. Because of the nature of the way streams are branched, any single barrier is going to confound a lot of fish trying to move to find these places. And this will result in a lot of long distance unintended consequences. So let's say where Andy works, there are bull trout, and a biologist is measuring them in their spawning habitat because it's easy to count big fish on their reds. And she notices that year by year, she has data from the past that they're declining. She may not realize that downstream 90 kilometers, there's a mine that's compromised their overwinter habitat. She's only measuring them in the spawning habitat. It's a long way away. Maybe she doesn't know that yet. Maybe that hasn't been figured out. That's the kind of thing that's unintended, downstream things affecting upstream populations. And here's an example then of data from those bull trout. There's a interesting paper. The Metolius in Oregon is a place you can actually fish for them. And so I had a chance to experience bull trout there. But here's the Imnaha River. It's relatively undisturbed. It's up in northeast Oregon next to Idaho. Bull trout, bull char overwinter down in the Snake or in the lower Imnaha and swim up into the headwaters there to spawn, which is where they're captured. This paper by Starkovich et al., they looked at a number of rivers and found that basically these fish have medians of movement that are, meaning the 50th percentile of the movement is in the 40, 50, 90 kilometer range. These fish move 1 to 10 kilometers a day. They come back to the same places every year. And obviously then barriers are going to confound this. And here's some data on 7 rivers where they tracked a number of fish. Obviously, these are difficult data, big fish, multiple years, but you can see that their migration distances in the Imnaha is the greatest, but for those that are not developed, that don't have very many barriers, it's about 50 kilometers that these fish need to carry out their life cycle. And when you reduce it to 20 kilometers with diversions for hay meadows and so on, then would you really expect these fish to be able to carry out that life cycle? Would you, if you couldn't get to the doctor, or you couldn't get to the grocery store, or you couldn't go to that venue to find a future partner, how would your life cycle turn out? Okay. Lesson 4 says that habitat diversity promotes life history diversity, which promotes resilience in these populations. So these are not the data produced from my lab. This is Ben Letcher's work all the way at the other end of the country for a different char, brook char, native brook char, So the Westbrook in Massachusetts is about 5 meters wide. There's a dam at the lower end, so they have been measuring this whole population 3 times a year for a long, long time, several decades, I believe. It has 2 tributaries. One's 2 meters wide, one's 1 meter wide. And what they found through both pit tagging and parentage analysis is that these fish are really using these tiny tributaries. Brook trout that they know were born in the mainstream are spawning in these tributaries. More than half their offspring are born in the tributaries, even though they were in the mainstream. And in wet years, it's more like 2/3. And so they cranked up a population genetic model and found out that if they blocked one of these tributaries, the whole thing would go extinct within 35 years. If they blocked both of them, it would go extinct in 18 years. So there is, I believe, the smaller tributary. So I don't know even very many fish biologists who would say that is critical to this population in keeping these fish persisting. And certainly nobody out there in the rest of the real world would say that a little tiny culvert under a dirt forest road that's, 15 meters long or so is a big deal. And yet that's what their data showed. I'd like to comment on the guy who analyzed this is Yoichiro Kano. He replaced me at Colorado State, has a position I once held, and Yoichiro is an amazing guy. He has way more skills than I do, and I'd encourage you to read his work. Well, we've done quite a bit of work on plain streams, and that says lesson 5, fishes in plain streams also need to move to persist. So this is the mighty Arickaree River out in eastern Colorado. Half of Colorado is in the Great Plains before you reach the mountains. This is the highest flow in May or June that's left in this river. And if you look at the Google Earth image, so this is going to be Jeff Falke's and Julie Scheuer's work, you can see what the land use is here. So the green outline is the lower part of the Arickaree. It's flowing from left to right up into the North Fork of the Republican. The border with Kansas is near that right edge of the slide, and Nebraska is up there to orient you. In the Arickaree Basin, 400 million cubic meters of water are pumped out of the ground every year in those crop circles, each of which the smaller ones are 1/4 mile across. And those 400 million cubic meters of water produce $400 million of agricultural products. These are some of the highest alfalfa and corn producing counties in the United States, partly because they're big counties. So a fish called the brassy minnow was declining, and we went out to study it. But what we ended up really studying was this whole river. Out of 16 native fish species, 7 have been lost. And you can see this is the wettest time of year. The river was originally 110 kilometers long. It had shrunk to about 60 in the wettest time. You can see it's cut off. The red means the channel is dry. Blue is flowing. Yellow over here means it's intermittent. There are pools, but they're not connected. If you fast forward to August, the river has dried down to about 10 to 15 kilometers. And we worked with groundwater hydrologists to link Jeff's flight data and walking pool census, walking over a 6-kilometer reach, 3 of them actually, but that's the main one that stayed wet, and linking that to groundwater. And we're able to predict that by 2045, 2/3 of the pools there had dried up and had basically shrunk to 1 kilometer long out of the original 110 kilometers in the driest part of the summer. So you can imagine what that might do for fish. In order to even keep this much habitat would have required reducing pumping by 3/4 to maintain the habitat. And given the value of the ag products, it's pretty hard to ask people to reduce their pumping, even though they do understand partly what's happening to the river. And when we scaled out with Josh Perk and Keith Gitto at Kansas State to look at the whole region, we found that in the region, I'll show you a map, we'd already lost 560 kilometers of river, and we're projected to lose another 290 about. So here's that whole region. We've been looking at the Arickaree, which is in the red oval. Up in the inset, you can see this is a blob of the whole Ogallala aquifer from South Dakota to Texas. It's the blob that's in Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska. And all of those small dots are wells, and all the big dots are dams on this river, these rivers. So over this region, we basically, over that kind of 110-year period, what we've lost and what we stand to lose, we're losing about 8 kilometers of river a year in this region. Those dams are also really important because there's a whole set of nondescript, small, silvery minnows about 3, 4, 5 inches long, like plains minnow and flathead chub and the Macrorhybopsis chubs that have lost, at least those 6 you can see. There's one you can't see. Basically lost 55 to 90% of their native range. And the reason is that they spawn semi-buoyant eggs that flow down these rivers, develop as they flow, and then the juveniles and adults make it back up those rivers throughout their life cycle. So when Josh Perkin and Keith Giddo looked at 60 different fragments and plotted them against the proportion of those 8 species that are extirpated, so over here on the left, that's all of them being extirpated. What they found was, unless you have about 100 kilometers of river, you can't have any of these species. And unless you have 200 to 300 kilometers of river, you can't have them all. So this is zero extirpated, meaning having all the species. You have to have, again, what fish biologist and honestly, what person out there would think that a 3-inch minnow needs 300 kilometers of river? So I'm going to switch gears here now and talk about interactions between streams and riparian zones. I took stream ecology from Ken Cummins, who then came to Oregon State, and then here to Northern California with Peggy Wilsbach. When I took stream ecology, the focus was on things falling into streams. Leaves and wood provide carbon and food and so on, grow food for aquatic invertebrates. We know then from Mary Power's work here in California and from Shigeru Nakano's work in Japan that the flows of invertebrates the other way, insects emerging from streams, are really a critical resource for forest animals. And so this lesson says, human-caused effects alter movement of invertebrates that support stream and forest animals. In 1995, Shigeru Nakano moved to the Tomakomai Experimental Forest in southern Hokkaido to become a research scientist and worked on this little stream called Horonai. And he was interested in that question of not only how was the forest important to the stream, but could it be the stream was important to the forest? And even though Nakano-san always wanted to know what it was like to be as tall as I was, he really became a giant in stream ecology just as he was killed and lost. And so his work then centered around this idea of could he manipulate things around this stream? And we had worked together in the mountains of Hokkaido on a different project, trying to understand how it is that Dollyvarden char shift to feeding on benthos, on bottom-dwelling insects. And I had used these simple drift nets to filter out invertebrates flowing into pools and then cause these fish to shift. Nakano saw that and realized, my stream would fit right inside one of these agricultural greenhouses that are all over Japan. And so he built a number of these, 8 to begin with, and was able to cut off all the bugs falling into streams and the invertebrates emerging out of streams. And so you may have seen this cartoon that we put into a paper looking at those fluxes of insects moving around. When they started measuring the effects, what they found was fully half of the annual energy that the salmonids in this Horonai stream used came from the forest insects. That was half their energy budget. And for riparian animals, fully a quarter of the bird annual energy budget came from emerging insects all throughout the seasons. This is a spring stream, it's open in the winter. There are winter stoneflies emerging and so on. And when they and Mary Power, for example, cut off these flows, for example, on the Eel River, not far from here, John Sabo's work with shields along the edges found that 40% of the lizards disappeared from the riparian zone. In Japan, 97% of bat foraging in May went down by 97% when the females need it for lactation and in their pregnancy. Spiders were reduced by 60, 80% when you cut off these flows. And for fish, it was a simple equation. You removed half their fish diet, half the biomass left if you left the ends open to these greenhouses. So the simple story is that about half the animals leave when they're missing these resources that are flowing from the other habitat. So after Nakano was lost, I wanted to honor his work, and I realized that anything we do in the riparian zone is going to affect these flows, whether it's cattle grazing or spraying for insects or cutting down the forest. And also, we knew that rainbow trout had invaded Japan. They're not native there, and Nakano's group had shown that they are able to get most of this falling input of invertebrates from the riparian zone. And so we predicted that that being the case, we knew that the Dollyvarden, which is the native char, would shift and hammer the benthos, the bottom-dwelling insects. That would reduce emergence to things like spiders, which we used as our surrogate animal. And also, not coincidentally then, because most of those are grazers, the algae would bloom because you had reduced the number of grazers, insect grazers from the bed. All of that happened. We went back to Japan. We did a big field experiment. One treatment was the greenhouses. One treatment was rainbow trout. One was a control with neither, and then both. So full factorial design, 4 replicates, 50-meter sections, and so on. And just to tell you one bottom line, when we added the rainbow trout, as we predicted, they got most of the terrestrials, the Dollyvarden shifted, they hammered the benthos, reduced emergence, and spiders in the riparian zone went down by 2/3 just by adding rainbow trout in the stream. This is Colden Baxter's postdoc work. So the corollary then from this lesson is really that streams in their riparian forests and grasslands have to be studied and managed as one ecosystem. And if you've seen the River Webs documentary, John Sabo says that basically in that documentary. And as a result, I've written this a while ago, but this will require training a new generation of biologists to understand the workings of both. And you are that new generation then that I hope is beginning to understand that these are really highly connected systems. So the take-home messages on the biology to date, I'll have to read this top one. Basically, fish movement is the glue that links together these fish habitats across riverscapes. And then these cross-ecosystem flows of invertebrates support greater densities and diversities of animals in both habitats than either could alone. This is pretty much verbatim out of Mary Power's tribute to a paper by Nakano and Murakami that appeared in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences just after Nakano was killed. And hence, sustaining these rich connections will promote more resilient biotic communities in the era that we're in of changing climates and human effects. Well, I want to change gears for the end of my talk and talk about another lesson that I've been trying to learn for the last 15 years. Really one based partly on this science, but also partly on other spheres of knowledge, such as values and ethics. that lesson also is quite simple, that rivers really are essential not only for fish, but as essential for us as humans as they are for fish. After learning an awful lot about fish and streams over this period, it became clear to me that another question is really central to what we do, and that is, why would people want to conserve rivers? We often preach to the choir, each other, we get down into the weeds, but 400 yards from here, nobody knows. Most of us, really. And those are the people who make decisions about rivers. And after all, we hadn't been very successful at bringing intact rivers with us into our future. Well, I first approached this as a scientist and found there's an awful lot of science out there. For example, the sound of running water is the most preferred natural sound that's ever been tested. And even the sight of streams, environmental psychologists have determined that simply seeing water features, and this includes lakes and actually oceans as well, reduces anxiety and the need for medication for everything from dental work to open heart surgery. Being near lakes and rivers and oceans helps improve ADHD, PTSD, outcomes for children with disabilities, of which we have a daughter who has disabilities, and may even improve our creativity and decision making. Much of the latest of this, up to about 10 years ago, is in this book, Blue Mind by Wallace Nichols, who's a marine biologist here in California, I understand. Evolutionary biologists, for their part, argue that we're really hardwired to seek these places that were so important to us during the first 125,000 years of evolution on the plains of Africa. And these habitats include key features: scattered trees, promontories to see things coming, and these riparian zones. Those bands of humans back when we were trying to eke out an existence and not go extinct, those bands of humans that could remember these places and find these riparian zones that offered shade and water and resources and places to recover our own physiology from the large mammals that wanted to eat us and the bands of other humans with whom we were competing. Those are the bands that survived and became what we are all today. I don't know about you, but after I encounter small bands of humans in faculty meetings, I really want a river to go to heal, right? But the science says the rivers are important, but for many, water is simply a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. This is the Cache Laputa River that runs through Fort Collins, where I come from. This is up in the mountains. This is obviously during spring runoff, going to be June where we live. And yet the recent proposal is to take most of this water and store it and basically turn that spring flow into something that looks more like fall and winter flow, which is what this looks like in the mountains. So this is our struggle as we wonder, how much more water can we store before we lose what's essential for fish, for the cottonwoods that are here, but also for us as humans. And so two things are really clear to me now after this 45-year journey I've been on to understand what's essential about rivers for fish and humans. The first is that we humans need something far more from our rivers than simply water to drink and grow crops and catch fish. It has to do with the wholeness and the resilience that we seek from these places. The coolness in the riparian on a hot summer day, and the mists rising from the bends on crisp fall mornings. And it has to do with these fish and other animals that are so well adapted to this relentless flow, ever seeking the oceans, and the flows of insects that move in both directions. In short, it has to do with a matter of the heart, the reverence that we have for these places that offer the murmuring, lilting half voices that can calm for us the inner half voices of doubt and fear that haunt, I think, everybody's soul. And the second thing that's clear to me now is that we will need an ethic for rivers, and this is what I'm writing about now, just finished another book, An Ethic to Guide Us When We Seek This Wholeness and Resilience. So I've often turned to the writings of Waldo Leopold, who I think wrote amazing essays that express this mixture of ethics and ecology that lies beyond the reach of language. But I happened a few years ago on an essay by Luna Leopold, who's the second son of Waldo and Estella Leopold. Many of you know he worked for the USGS here in the West and was famous for pondering this interface between the utilitarian uses of water and an ethic for managing it. So 45 years ago, during your drought in the late 70s, he penned an essay titled A Reverence for Rivers. If you've not read that, I'd encourage you to. It's only 2 pages long. If you've read it, it's worth reading again. He wrote that sound water management will require the highest levels of statesmanship in facing the reality of finite resources like water. And he concludes with this tension between the practical and the ethical. To test whether the hydrologic system is operating satisfactorily by economic and legal criteria alone will not guarantee its continued health. What is needed is some deeper feeling. He harks back to the Greek historian Herodotus of the 5th century before the current era, who wrote of the Persians that at that time they never defiled their waters because they have a great reverence for rivers. And so I remain on this journey even after 45 years, seeking to understand what is essential about rivers for both fish and humans. And I'll close with a simple passage I wrote for the introduction to the book that Ken mentioned. Ultimately, I realized that like trees and music and good health, streams and rivers are a gift to us as humans. They're part of the essence of our lives in these surroundings we inhabit within our own boundaries of place and time. They cause our deepest emotions to gather and flow near the surface and make our days and our seasons and our years worth living. They are essential for us to be whole people, psychologically and spiritually. We need their sounds and their views and their sound advice. And in the end, I believe we will need to understand how and why we love rivers if we hope to conserve them. Thank you very much. So I hope I've left no time for questions, but no, if anybody has a question, I don't know what time there is left, but.
We have 6 minutes for questions if people want to come down
All
here
right.
and ask a question. If not, we can move on. If you do ask a question from your seat, the folks online won't hear it. So it's best to come down here.
You know, while we're waiting for that, some of you know Ryan Fogarty up there in Wairika. He works for the Fish and Wildlife Service, I think, on Fish Passage. Yeah. So Ryan, somebody was asking about, be great to get like Nakano's ideas to managers. Ryan nominated with a group of people this guy, Shigeru Nakano, for a Conservation Hero Award. The first person to win this award was Rachel Carson. And I was just blown away. And when I asked him why, he said, well, I told my biologists every time we do a project, I want you to think about how it links to this other habitat. And it was the first time I, had experienced somebody saying, yeah, we watched this Riverwebs film or we read the book and it made a difference that way. And I was really blown away. So thanks to Ryan.
I'll ask you a question, Kurt.
Darn.
Just trying to postpone my talk.
Yes.
Being involved in processes where these other attributes of rivers, these human desires for rivers, are tried to put into an economic valuation process. Do you see that as a useful tool, or is that just a fool's errand to try and put an economic value to these other things you talked about?
Yeah, I'm sure there are uses there, but I'm a little bit more on the fool's errand side, because once you monetize it, so you destroy the Rickery River and somebody is making billions of dollars or millions of dollars of that. And it's like, can you recreate a river? So we do that with mountaintop mining. You rip the coal out of it, and then you put all the spoils back, and they try to make a river, and it just doesn't work. So yeah, I think that's obviously the very difficult part of that is how you translate the values into how much water you're going to take out of the Trinity and what it means for the Sacramento and what you've left there and what those ag products are worth. You know, my dad was a professor of animal science. I was raised on the value of agriculture. So I understand that thinking, and there are going to be 9 billion people to feed, so we can't deny it. But it does come down to whether, for example, do you want a river running through Fort Collins, Colorado, or not? And what can you have? We take currently 3/4 of the water out of the river already, and the new big reservoir that's proposed and permitted and being contested in court is to take half of the quarter that's left. So would you really expect to have a real river when you had 1/8 of the flow? Probably not. Thanks again.